everyone. Thank you very much for coming this evening and for joining us online. My name is Nicole Smith. I'm filling in for Dr. Adam Nuns this evening. And I just welcome, this is our first hybrid Civil War Roundtable program. So thank you for being here. Just so you know, if you are watching at home, you're welcome to put any questions in the chat or the comments on Facebook. All of our programs and webinars are being live streamed on the History Center Facebook page and recorded and available at the York County History Center YouTube channel. Just a couple announcements from the History Center for upcoming things. There you go. There's a little bit there on tonight's program, which Scott is going to introduce. We do have an event coming up next week called Made in America, which is a community event. It's discounted admission at our Industrial Museum. Then on June 19th, we are opening a exhibit for celebrating Juneteenth right here in this room. It's going to be a timeline of Black history. So please come and check that out. We actually, as part of this exhibit, we have a rare printed copy of the original copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is actually on exhibit tonight in our lobby. So please check that out. Signed by Abraham Lincoln. And then next week on June 23rd is our All Vets program. And the speaker says is Al Ferguson, who is a Vietnam veteran. I'm going to turn it over now to Scott. Thank you very much. And don't forget that for more information about our programs and to make reservations for the library or programs, visit our website, yorkhistorycenter.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. I also want to thank the History Center for welcoming us back to some live presentations. We want to welcome everyone who's joining us here in person and in the virtual land there. Right now, we are going to continue having some hybrid meetings in the months ahead as we're readjusting to coming out of COVID and as people get more comfortable with being in groups, but we will continue this format for the foreseen future. For those who are here, who would like to donate to our speaker fund, we do have a basket over by the door going into the main lobby for whoever would like to contribute to that. And before we introduce tonight's speaker, I want to tell you about what we have coming up next month. Next month, we're going to have Ron Kirkwood for an encore visit for his talk called George Spangler, the Most Important Farm, Battle of Gettysburg. He describes his program. First off, he said that he is the author of Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm, Hospitals, and the Battle of Gettysburg. It's published by Savas Beatty in hardcover in 2019. It went into its second hardcover printing in October 2019 and was published in paperback in January of this year and in audio format February this year. And it's also available on e-readers as well. So in this program, Kirkwood argues in Too Much for Human Endurance that the George Spangler Farm was the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg, revealing factors that have been overlooked for generations, such as the presence on the farm directly behind the line of the Army of the Potomac Artillery Reserve, ammunition train, and 5th Corps and 6th Corps line for rapid movement on the farm's roads to the fighting all over the line. Powers Hill also was on the Spangler's farm and played a critical military role and served as the location of Major General George Meade's second headquarters during and after the battle. Kirkwood is a retired 40-year career as an editor and writer in newspapers and magazines, including USA Today, Baltimore Sun, Harrisburg Patriot News, and the York Daily Record. He was sports editor of the York Daily Record from 1984 to 88, edited national magazines for USA Today, Sports, and was National Football League editor for USA Today, Sports Weekly. Won numerous state, regional, and national writing and editing awards during his career, and managed the 32-person copy desk in Harrisburg when the newspaper won a Pulitzer Prize in 2012. He's a Michigan native, graduate of Central Michigan University, where he's returned as guest speaker to journalism classes as part of the school's first visiting professional series. He's been a Gettysburg Foundation guide at the George Spangler Farm Civil War Field Hospital site since its opening in 2013. He lives in Manchester Township, York County, with his wife for 44 years, Barbara, a retired first grade teacher at Leaders Heights Elementary School in Downtown School District. Both of his daughters are graduates of that school as well. Previously, we did have Mr. Kirkwood here presenting to us about the Spangler Farm. And in his previous presentation, he spoke more about the farm's role as a hospital. But this presentation will go deeper into the military role that the farm played in Battle of Gettysburg. So now that we've sort of introduced what we're going to be doing next month, we're going to introduce tonight's speaker, Codie Eash, who's coming to speak to us tonight about the old Keystone State Speaks Today, the Gettysburg, Pennsylvania Veterans Reunion of 1889. So let us welcome Codie as he gives his presentation.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you everyone who is here. It's wonderful to be back in an in-person event. You know, it's been a while for the Roundtable here to be able to do this, and for me personally, it's been since October of 2019 that I've had an in-person audience. I'm fortunate to be in public history at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center in Gettysburg, so I've still had the opportunity since we reopened last June to be able to speak to folks on a daily basis in terms of presenting history, but to come to a lecture, to a lecture hall, to be able to discuss something in this format is wonderful to do. And welcome to everybody who is joining us virtually as well. I think that over the past year, we've all learned that that's a really wonderful way that we are able to communicate with people and do history over long distances. And so hopefully we'll still continue to have the ability to not only have things in person, but over long distances as well. I'd like to thank everybody here at the York County History Center for having us, for the Civil War Roundtable, for the invitation. It's really great to be here in my hometown. I grew up in West York. This is the first time I think I've spoken in York in any capacity. I graduated of West York High School 10 years ago. So traveled all around the area, worked in Gettysburg, but returned to my roots here in York and talk about an event that the York Press covered. And we'll talk more in a little while. Gettysburg reunion that took place in 1889. And when we think about Gettysburg reunions, for a good reason, our minds do first go to those particularly large blue-gray reunions, such as 1913 for the 50th anniversary, when there are some 55,000 Civil War veterans, including men of both armies, who come to Gettysburg for about a week-long peace jubilee, as it was officially termed. Or we go to 1938, the 75th anniversary, that so-called last reunion of the blue and gray. And these massive blue-gray reunions are really appealing to the audiences then and to us today for the massive spectacles that they were, for the reconciliationist principles that are at stake there. But by and large, most Gettysburg reunions, most Civil War reunions will not be amongst blue and gray, not amongst United States and Confederate veterans, but rather amongst men from their own side, from their own state, from their own regiments. And in September 1889, at Gettysburg, would have occurred, probably aside from 1913, perhaps the largest reunion among Civil War veterans that had ever taken place in Gettysburg. Now, this is a really difficult thing to prove. There's no official count. And as we'll see as we go through, the numbers of people who were apparently at this reunion range anywhere from, I believe, 10,000 to excess of 50,000. And so if we take that 50,000 number at face value, this could have been a reunion that was just about as large as what happened in 1913 at that large blue-gray reunion. I want to take us back to before what happens here in 1889, when these veterans return from the state of Pennsylvania. They dedicate 53 Pennsylvania monuments on the battlefield. And that is the principal purpose of this reunion, is to dedicate Pennsylvania monuments and memorials in the Gettysburg battlefield. But I want to go back first to the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863. And here we can put into context what Pennsylvania meant to Pennsylvania soldiers and, as time would go on, Pennsylvania veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the man on the screen there is Colonel James Mccarter. At the time of the battle, he did not command the 93rd Pennsylvania, but he is riding along with the 93rd Pennsylvania on a horse. He had suffered from a wound. He's not in direct command of these soldiers, but he's going to be a very inspiring presence to them. And I also think, as a side note, that we always talk about who has the best Civil War beard. I think that James Mccarter is in the conversation for worst Civil War hair, probably, from what we can see of him there. Nevertheless, one of the veterans in that regiment would later recall in his own monument dedication speech that as the soldiers of the 93rd Pennsylvania were in Manchester, Maryland, they're just south of Mason-Dixon line, and they're about to enter Pennsylvania. For many of these soldiers, the first time in a year, 2 years, since they've been on their home state soil. And this man recalled that Mccarter, reportedly sitting on his horse, yelled down at these soldiers, "My countrymen, comrades in arms, Pennsylvanians, the destroyer has come. Fell treason's foul foot has polluted the soil dedicated forever sacred to freedom. Northern hearthstones are threatened. The chains of slavery are clanking, and they are forging fetters to crush your patriotic spirit. The issue is joined, the stupendous conflict has commenced. Freedom or slavery are the momentous issues of the hour. Sons of liberty, go forth with alacrity to the battle of the civilized world where God himself mustered the hosts to war. Soldiers we have met before in the shock of battle where destruction reveled and danced and death danced as at a festal scene. Again we go. Should you fall, the spot will be forever sacred to freedom, and a monument immortal as the ages shall arise to your memory. A nation will be your mourners, the liberty loving of every tongue and tribe, class, and kindred will tender you the tribute of a tear. Let us go forward then." That's a rousing speech in that moment to these soldiers who are about to enter Pennsylvania. There have been some questions over time as to whether he actually spoke those words. Those words are printed in a monument dedication speech that is delivered at the reunion that we're going to be speaking about tonight. But nevertheless, even if Mccarter did not speak those exact words, the idea that is there gives us a semblance of what it meant for these Pennsylvanians, even if this was written in hindsight, 26 years after the battle in 1889, it's very clear that Pennsylvanians hold Gettysburg as a site that is their own. It is where they defended not only their home state soil, but the nation at large. We can even see this in more famous example, a brief one from Colonel Strong Vincent, Colonel of the 83rd Pennsylvania, eventually a brigade commander in the 5th Army Corps at Gettysburg. And just days before his death, he reportedly stated, this Erie County native, "What more glorious death can any man desire than to die on the soil of old Pennsylvania, fighting for that flag?" And as many of you are aware, he is mortally wounded July 2nd, 1863, at the Battle of Gettysburg. In the days after the battle, there are going to be these early efforts to memorialize the battlefield. That sets the scene for every monument, for every reunion that will take place in years and decades, and now the better part of 2 centuries later, that would have taken place among these veterans and among people who visit the battlefield today. The first memorial of any sort, we could say, is Soldiers National Cemetery, dedicated 4.5 months after the battle, the occasion for the speech we now know as the Gettysburg Address. 2 years later, we have the first monument on the battlefield, the top left, Soldiers National Monument. Its cornerstone is dedicated just after the 2nd anniversary of the battle. And the man who would be right here was the keynote speaker that day, and that was Major General Oliver Otis Howard, who by then would have been taking up as the chairman of the Freedmen's Bureau, but had command of the 11th Corps of the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Gettysburg. We will then start to see the first regimental monument of any sort. Right here in the center at the top, the first Minnesota Memorial Urn, dedicated in 1867. And with a tad bit of irony, when the veterans of the 1st Minnesota requested a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield, it was accepted, but it was accepted with some reluctance. They requested to build a monument to the 1st Minnesota dead. That was their exact claim. But the state legislature of Minnesota said that on the basis that they think that one great national monument and the granite stone, referring to tombstones, which the association will place at each grave, will be all that is necessary in the way of commemoration, and that one monument will be disproportionately small, so near to the large shaft, which would eventually be Soldiers National Monument. That was the cornerstone over here. It became that monument. Minnesotans are basically saying, wouldn't it be strange if we put up a monument? And it's the only state to put up a monument because there's this large monument, and that should probably cover everybody. Well, as we all know today, if you visit Gettysburg, it's the largest sculpture garden in the world. There are about 1,300 monuments, markers, memorials of one sort or another. The New York Times prophesied, I guess we could say, that after the first Minnesota urn was dedicated, that it is beautiful to the heart as well as to the eye, and we could wish that every state would thus adorn the resting place of its dead. Elsewhere, a single rose blooms or a little flag waves over a single mound, but Minnesota alone has thus adorned all her sons. We trust it will not long be so, and it is not long so. Soldiers National Monument, as we said, is completed in 1869. Its keynote speaker, George Gordon Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. The first monument outside of the National Cemetery will be the strong Vincent Memorial. I just mentioned Vincent a moment ago, mortally wounded at Little Round Top, at the site where he was reportedly shot down. A monument is dedicated in 1878. That will be followed 1 year later by the first regimental monument outside of the National Cemetery, the 2nd Massachusetts in Spangler's Meadow, basically at the foot of Culp's Hill. And then the first statue on the battlefield to Gouverneur Warren on the west side of Little Round Top in 1888 for the 25th anniversary of the battle. Now, many other monuments are, of course, dedicated intermixed throughout all those we've just listed, but those are all the firsts that we have on the Gettysburg battlefield. This is a bird's eye map from 1888, the year before the Pennsylvania Day reunion, which depicts from the northwest the town of Gettysburg, giving you a sense of the battlefield, the town, its surrounding area. And then surrounding this would be all of the monuments, or most of the monuments, not just Pennsylvania, but all states that had been dedicated up to that time. Gettysburg is becoming the site of Civil War memory. We start to see in those 25 years after that this is the place. If folks are going to go to one location, this is where they will go to understand the Civil War and its consequences. And as this happens, we start to see that right around the 25th anniversary of the battle, there are all these states hosting specific days for the veterans from their particular states. In 1885 is Massachusetts Day. In 87 is Ohio Day. In 88 is New Jersey Day. In 89 is Michigan Day and Maine Day. And of course, Pennsylvania Day, as we'll discuss. Illinois Day is in 1891. New York Day is in 1893, etc. So that 25th to 30th anniversary of the battle, all of these states are deciding, let's all go, all of the veterans of our particular homes, let's go dedicate our monuments at roughly the exact same time. And that will be, by and large, how monuments are dedicated in that 25th to 30th anniversary period. Now, Pennsylvania had started planning its day in 1887, and their goal was to have it take place in 88 for the 25th anniversary of the battle. The issue becomes, as we'll see, that first of all, they started their planning a little bit too late. They didn't really understand the scale of what this would eventually become. At the Battle of Gettysburg, about a third of the soldiers who served under a United States flag were from the state of Pennsylvania. It's a massive endeavor to bring as many of those veterans as possible back to the battlefield. Nevertheless, in 1887, the Pennsylvania General Assembly is going to set aside $121,500. That's about $3.3 million today. For the purpose, the bill states, of perpetuating the participation in and marking by suitable memorial tablets of bronze or granite the position of each of the commands of Pennsylvania volunteers engaged in the Battle of Gettysburg. It allowed Pennsylvania's governor, who at that time was James Beaver, himself a Gettysburg veteran of the 148th Pennsylvania, namesake for Beaver Stadium at Penn State. It allowed him to appoint 5 commissioners. They would not be paid, and their duty is to select and decide upon the design and material for each Pennsylvania monument. The commissioners were tasked with cooperating with 5 veterans of each regimental association, and they would determine the location of the monuments and approve where that location was, or move it if it was not approved. And upon agreement, each monument was then subject to the final approval of the Pennsylvania Auditor General. And as a result of that, the state treasurer once the design was approved, would give each regimental association $1,500, which is the equivalent of about $40,400 today. That will be in direct compensation from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for these veterans to go approach whomever, whatever sculptor they would like to build their monument. And then it was up to them what the design would be. Now, so if you're wondering what's the cost of a Gettysburg monument, $40,400 basically, the price, I guess, of a nice new truck or SUV. If a particular veterans group did not agree on a final design within 12 months or a location within 12 months, the commissioners, said the bill, shall have a suitable monument erected of the material aforesaid, and a warrant for the cost thereof shall be drawn by the Auditor General in the manner provided. So basically, it was up to you. Whatever design you wanted, it had to be approved. But if you didn't get a design approved within 12 months, the state would erect some monument for you. There's no harm, no foul. It just wouldn't be up to you what your design looked like. The guarantee here is that every Pennsylvania unit that served at the Battle of Gettysburg was going to get a monument paid for by its Commonwealth. Beaver will approve this plan on June 15th, 1887. And on June 27th, he will commission, the number grew, but he initially commissions 5 individuals. President John P. Taylor, sitting state senator J.P.S. Govan, John P. Nicholson, R. Bruce Ricketts, and Samuel Harper would serve as the secretary. And Harper, consequentially, will become the most consequential of these men because of his death, as we'll talk about in a moment. And it's really that reason why this thing keeps getting delayed. Now, the plan for Pennsylvania Day is that it be November 1888 Board of Commissioners. And as we can see just by the date, November 1888, they've missed the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, which would have taken place that July. Nicholson, who is on the board, submitted a resolution providing for a committee to confer with Governor Beaver, having in view the setting apart a day for the dedication of the monuments in 1889 under the auspices of the state with appropriate ceremonies. And the bill says that it will be styled Pennsylvania Day. So the official title is born in November 1889. The governor entered heartily into the suggestions of the bill, and at a conference with the commissioners set aside May 11th and 12th, 1889. See by the date, you can see it up here, it's a little dark. September is when this would actually take place. So it is delayed by several months. Governor Beaver is going to approve an act on May 8th, 1889, establishing that $50,000, which is worth about $1.4 million today, would be set aside for transportation. So any veteran who could prove that he was from Pennsylvania, that he served in a Pennsylvania unit at the Battle of Gettysburg, that he was honorably discharged, that's one of the stipulations, it would be paid. His transportation would be paid. And we see that same sort of thing at the 1913 reunion, but on a much larger scale nationally for Civil War veterans. In this case, for Pennsylvania veterans, as long as they were still living in the state of Pennsylvania, they were honorably discharged, they fought at Gettysburg, they get a train ticket that's going to be at their local train station. They can use that to come to Gettysburg in September 1889. And the commissioners began working immediately on a program. However, based on the serious illness of Samuel Harper, the man I mentioned a moment ago, he dies on May 16th, which is right around the time that they're planning on having this. And so everything is cast aside for just a moment. They're going to delay it a few more months. They realize that the transportation program is a little bit bigger than they had anticipated. Again, the number of veterans who are interested in this, it's something that kind of blows the mind of the Commonwealth. There are way more veterans who want to come back to Gettysburg. It's going to take them some time, the state, to get transportation. So they're going to settle upon September 11th and 12th. After Harper died, Nicholson, John Page Nicholson, became the secretary, and Brigadier General D.H. Hastings, who was the Adjutant General of Pennsylvania, he took responsibility for ensuring transportation for veterans. And the board expresses its, quote, hearty thanks for the faithful performance of this duty, which to a great extent made the occasion a success. They realized that getting these veterans there is the most important thing that they could possibly do. Without veterans, there's no Pennsylvania Day. Now, this is a bigger picture matter. I don't want to delve too much into this, but what is the process for a monument being approved at Gettysburg at that time? This is a document from October 7th, 1887, listing all of the specifications. There are categories labeled foundations, material, number of stones, workmanship, permanency, inscriptions, markers, inspection of the work, bonds, proposals. and the coat of arms. And the last point there is interesting because that's how you can tell when you go to Gettysburg today or other battlefields like Antietam for that matter. You can tell if a monument was paid for by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it'll have the state coat of arms on it. That's the case for other states as well, but here in the case of Pennsylvania. So when a regimental association wanted to dedicate a monument, if they want to show up at the 1889 reunion, this is what they're going to have to look at. This is the guideline for what their monument could be made of, where it could go. Then you would typically see the article of agreement. Everything here is kind of pre-filled out with the exception of the little lines here that have a state of, you enter Pennsylvania there. This would be the number of the regiment, so 83rd Regiment of Pennsylvania you would put there. And then you continue filling out all of the lines throughout. And this is kind of the cookie cutter submission that all the regimental associations would submit. And typically they'll submit a sketch of a monument. This is a particularly well done one. Oftentimes they're relatively crude, but usually they'll give a pretty good sketch and they'll either be approved or denied. They're approved almost unanimously. We'll talk about one that is actually a couple that did not get approved for varying reasons. And then you typically would have had a little sketch of a map as well with some descriptions of where soldiers wanted it to go. I forget which regiment this one's for. I think 111th Pennsylvania it is. They could see where they wanted to put their monument. And they use other battlefield landmarks. Here's a stone fence. This would be Party Field. For those familiar with the battlefield, this would be kind of the lower summit of Coltsville, upper summit would be up here. There's Rebel Monument, talk more about that, and the 2nd Maryland Infantry Monument. That monument upsets a lot of the veterans who came here for Pennsylvania Day. Just gives you an idea of the process. They would submit something like this to show where they wanted it to go. A lot of press coverage leading up to Pennsylvania Day and this reunion. A couple of examples here. The National Tribune, which is kind of the mouthpiece of the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest United States veterans organization, of course, that comes out of the Civil War. In its June 14th, 1888 edition, the National Tribune announced the origins of a movement in view of the appointment of a Pennsylvania Day at Gettysburg. Prominent GAR men think the movement a good one. As far away as Nebraska, the Red Cloud Chief in July of 1888 was disappointed that Pennsylvania's war governor, Andrew Curtin, was loudly called for but would not be present at Gettysburg's 25th anniversary, but rejoiced in knowing that Pennsylvania's State Monument Commission will hold a business meeting to select Pennsylvania Day at Gettysburg. The Bloomsburg Columbian here in Pennsylvania announced to Central Pennsylvania veterans that your day has been postponed, but the different regiments will have already made preparations to decorate their monuments at Gettysburg, and so on and so forth. Would be all these announcements to veterans that if you're not getting the word elsewhere, reading this paper, you will now know that you are invited to Gettysburg to dedicate monuments upon the field. I would say that probably nowhere in the state do we see more excitement for this than among veterans of Pittsburgh. Western Pennsylvania veterans are particularly interested in coming back to Gettysburg in large numbers, and they play a really crucial role in kind of the entirety of this story for several reasons that we'll discuss. They particularly focus, understandably, upon units that were from Pittsburgh or the Pittsburgh area. 62nd Pennsylvania, for instance, is a pretty interesting one. These veterans are so excited that when they first have their meeting to discuss the plan for the design of the monument and their plan to come to Gettysburg, all these veterans are just talking about how excited they are to go to Gettysburg. And the meeting minutes say that by the conclusion of the meeting, they've actually decided upon nothing. It was just a bunch of veterans now discussing 25 years after the fact old war stories. So they have to replan their meeting, and they will eventually do that. The Pittsburgh Dispatch stated that veteran soldiers from all parts of the western end of the state were in the city last night. This was on August 18th, so 3 weeks or so before. The men who had not seen each other since the war met, shook hands, and exchanged experiences and reminiscences. The cause of this gathering of old war horses was the making of arrangements to attend the dedication of monuments at Gettysburg Battlefield on Pennsylvania Day, September 11th and 12th. But for varying reasons, none of the regimental associations completed their arrangements, and another meeting of each will be necessary before they are ready to start. On August 23rd in the Pittsburgh Dispatch, which you can see I don't have, I guess, an image of the paper itself, but you can see the lack of an H. This was Pittsburgh's period where the post office and the newspapers did not have the H on it. That's gone in and out of Pittsburgh history through the years. But Colonel D.S. Keller was in charge of 3 clerks who were responsible for, in their words, the furnishing of transportation to soldiers who participated in the 3-day battle of Gettysburg. And as of publication that day, August 23rd, Keller and company received approximately 400 applications per day, with some days as many as 1,100 from veterans, and required more assistance to process them, including through regimental secretaries representing any unit that would have members present. So again, that idea that the state of Pennsylvania, at these local individual levels, regimental associations are getting way more requests than they assumed. They estimated they would receive a conservative estimate of 10,000 veterans total, but they are getting now 1,100 per day. Upon verification with official records, the actual process for getting a veteran to the battlefield will be that a ticket is ordered once that veteran says he would like to go. And then that ticket will be produced by the railroad company that at a rail line that was most convenient for that particular veteran. He would sign his ticket upon reception there at the rail station. And then when that veteran arrived in Gettysburg in September, he would sign for the ticket again. So it's a really foolproof system. And then he would receive his tent. So that was the process by which soldiers were verified. The tent was provided by the state, and one of the papers quipped that during their stay at Gettysburg, no expense will be entailed to veterans on them except for putting up the canvas. And so the only thing they had to pay was you have to put up your own tent. Now, a curious example of social issues of the time would come here in the case of the 74th Pennsylvania. To me, one of the most beautiful, kind of haunting monuments on the battlefield of a wounded color bearer. But here we have a 11th Corps unit, and the 11th Corps famously, roughly 50% or so, German-American immigrants at the Battle of Gettysburg, and that plays a role in these veterans' experiences leading up to the 1889 reunion. Basically, veterans of the 74th Pennsylvania were denied transportation on account that the state said there was no proof of their existence, no proof of their presence at the Battle of Gettysburg. According to the books at Harrisburg, is what they cite very vague. Conrad Schlegel, who was a private in the regiment in 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg, by 1889 was vice president of that unit's Veterans Association. And he threatened to sue the state. And once he does that, basically they clear up the problem once he threatens to sue. The 74th Pennsylvania had, after all, dedicated this monument on the plains north of Gettysburg along Howard Avenue in 1888. They already had a monument on the battlefield. And by 1889, the state of Pennsylvania, which paid for this monument, there's the seal, says there's no proof that you men were at the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, when he sues, the state comes back and says that it was recognized as a mistake. But a lot of these veterans in their private correspondence and in their press reports will say that they felt that there was some xenophobia involved here. They assumed that because they were German-American immigrants, there was this kind of widespread effort by the state to not get these men back at Gettysburg. And a lot of them assumed that it was because if you had a monument already placed prior to 1889, you would receive another $1,500 from the state. In this case, these men had their monument paid for by the state. But for a lot of regiments that paid for a monument on their own dime, it was seen as a treat that the state would now give you an additional expenditure. And these men assumed that because of their status as former immigrants, that they were not going to be gifted this. Eventually, it's cleared up, and they do arrive in September of '89. On August 29th, 1889, in an edition of the Annapolis, Maryland Evening Capital, printed the general itinerary of what was to happen in September 1889. And the idea here is that there are going to be one day where all the veterans would dedicate their monuments. That'll be on September the 11th. And then on September 12th, there's supposed to be a parade. The key word is supposed to. We'll hold on to that for a moment. And then there's going to be a large ceremony at Soldiers National Cemetery to turn the monuments over from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, which was kind of a precursor to what we know as Gettysburg National Military Park today. These are the themes, and we'll go through some of the individual reunions and speeches among the veterans at the reunions. But these are the general themes that if you look through all of the 53 monuments that are dedicated, that they really touch upon. They talk about personal biographies, give a unit sketch talking about what did each unit do during the course of the Civil War, and especially at Gettysburg. They give a tactical summary of what did they do on the battlefield. And this is kind of one of the unique things about monument dedication speeches, is that though they're not as immediate as a letter home or a diary, though they're not maybe as personal as a memoir, they are in a unique way, a document that is delivered on the site where events actually happen. And so when a soldier is talking about a wounded comrade and where he was wounded, he's standing basically at the spot where that man was wounded. When they're talking about a charge that they made in the battle, these soldiers are delivering these speeches where the monuments are being dedicated, which is where those charges took place. And so they're very unique documents for that reason. One of the huge themes that these men talk about is the preservation of battlefields and monuments for subsequent generations. The phrase children and children's children is probably, aside from just about any quotation from the Gettysburg Address, probably the most popular line that appears in these monument dedications time and time again. They talk a lot about fighting on their home state soil. That concept that we began with is a very important thing for Pennsylvanians to say we defended our home soil. They talk about Gettysburg's place in antiquity, not just in the American story, but in the international story. A lot of soldiers liken what happened at Gettysburg to Thermopylae or Waterloo. That's a common theme for all Gettysburg veterans. Of course, they talk about Union and national regeneration, the main issue for which most of these soldiers had probably enlisted in the first place in 1861 or 62 or 63. They talk about death and loss in the most personal moments of these speeches, talking about what happened, as I mentioned, where they're standing. And usually those are very tragic stories. They talk about loyalty versus treason. There is no reconciliation in most of these speeches. That idea of veterans wanting to shake hands across the chasm, that's gone from the picture once there are soldiers from their home state and they're surrounded by their own comrades. We see this theme that pops up over and over again where soldiers say, I'll shake the hand of a Confederate veteran. I'll recognize that he was a soldier and I can appreciate that. But he was a traitor. We hear that word traitor come up often. The concept of treason is very much in a lot of these speeches. Just like liberty versus slavery, we see this theme come up as well. Soldiers admitted that when they enlisted in 1861 or 62 or 63, that they didn't feel like they were fighting to end slavery, but they realized now a quarter century later that the most fundamental thing that came as a result of the Civil War was the liberty of 4 million enslaved people. And that becomes a really powerful message that these veterans want to showcase in these dedication speeches. And finally, they talk a lot about Confederate memory. I have a couple of really in-depth examples. The big takeaway on that one, and I have a couple of maybe controversial kind of toe-curling examples of things that these men said. The big takeaway there is hatred of Confederate monuments, opposition to Confederate flags is nothing new. Probably the people who hated Confederate monuments most were these Pennsylvania veterans and Civil War veterans who fought on the Union side. So each of these themes are covered in some amount of speeches. We're going to go through a couple of them just to kind of highlight some of these examples here. We'll go through and just kind of give you a list, first of all of the regiments that dedicated monuments with an image taken not too long after. Most of these are taken by William Tipton, Gettysburg photographer. Here we have the 23rd, 26th, and 27th Pennsylvania Infantry. We have the 28th Pennsylvania Infantry. We have the 29th, the 38th, and the 46th, the 38th in the center, also known as the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves. Here we have the 49th, the 53rd, and the 56th. Here we have the 57th, 62nd, and 63rd. Bear in mind the 63rd, we'll talk more about them right at the end. This piece in particular, this is their corps badge. Monument still looks like this if you go there today. These veterans did not like how their monument turned out. Here we have the 69th, the 73rd, and the 81st. Here we have the 83rd with a great example of a sketch with some side views and dimensions there. Gives you a nice example of what these veterans would have drawn whenever they were preparing for their monument to be dedicated, with the likeness there of Strong Vincent on top. Keep that one in mind, along with the 63rd. Those two things are tied together as far as why those 63rd Pennsylvania veterans I just mentioned didn't like their monument. Here we have the 84th, the 88th, and the 91st. And a brief moment with the 84th on the left-hand side here. A unique regiment in that they're the only unit on the battlefield, which I'm aware that did not fight at the Battle of Gettysburg. They were guarding supply trains, and they state that right on their monument, an important logistical duty. But the 84th Pennsylvania is unique for another reason. It is probably the single most anti-Confederate speech that is delivered on the Gettysburg battlefield by a United States veteran. Brief piece of it here from the speaker, Captain Thomas E. Merchant. And for context, 1889 is 3 years after the first Confederate monument had been dedicated at Gettysburg on Culp's Hill. We'll talk more about that monument in a bit. Other veterans had some things to say about it. But Thomas E. Merchant says that the once soldiers of the Confederacy are entitled as individuals to every manly consideration at our hands. As individuals, they are, as we are, men walking along the journey of life, reaching out to one common goal. So the first part, kind of a rosy picture. Confederate veterans are veterans, just like we are. But, he says, their organized bodies have no claim upon us for recognition. Government shall have taken the life of every camp of organizations like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and United Daughters of the Confederacy at the birth. And its strong arm should have swept from its soil the first monument to rebellion, with the warning that the placing of the second would be known as treason. They have been asking that the war be forgotten, and yet they keep us daily reminded by the flaunting of the Confederate bars and flags. No monument to treason should have been permitted a place on this or any other field. And being here should be returned to the donors, not to be erected elsewhere. No government is strong enough to glorify treason upon itself, nor to encourage it elsewhere. The individual I can take most heartily by the hand, the organization I discard. There can be no true call for a union of the blue and gray. Let all don the blue. So if you're attending Gettysburg on September 11th, 1889, it's a pretty fiery speech that you're probably standing in front of. A veteran who is kind of not directly talking about the monument that's a couple miles away on Culp's Hill, but that's what he's talking about. A lot of these veterans were upset when they got there that monument had been there, and that there were rumors that in a few years' time, other Confederate units and states might be dedicating some of their own as well. Here we have also dedicated that same day. All these are dedicated September 11th, 1889. The 93rd, 98th, and 99th Pennsylvania. The 102nd, the 105th, and the 106th. Brief moment with the 105th in the center, the Wildcat Regiment. They're oftentimes referred to, the little circle at the top here, as a bas-relief of a wildcat, due to their nickname. Their speaker is Chaplain J.C. Truesdale. And this is a common theme throughout all Gettysburg reunion speeches and dedication speeches, is that usually it was a regimental chaplain or a man who had in the years since the war become a reverend. And we see a lot of ministers and chaplains speaking, I would assume, because they're probably the men most used to public speaking, giving sermons in front of congregations each Sunday. But Chaplain Truesdale is a unique speech in that, for my money, among all these speeches, it probably is the one that combines the most into one speech. He touches on basically every one of those topics that I just had listed a few moments ago on one of those slides. This is the longest excerpt that I'll share with you this evening, but I think that it is a really good one to examine. I'll show you at the end where you can go read these speeches in their entirety if you'd like to. But just to give you a sense of these all-encompassing speeches, these veterans who had probably a better chance here than anywhere to say as much as they wanted to say. He said, "These marble shafts," referring to the monuments, "all over this battlefield, talk to us of our soldier dead. They are object lessons, silent teachers of our country's history and institutions, and of loyalty and law. When our children and our children's children," that's that phrase, "shall come, and when the stranger from other lands shall come and read this battle record, they will know that in our time there were men who had such love for their country and courage of their convictions that they did not count their lives dear to them, if only this government of the people, by the people, for the people might not perish from the earth." A direct quotation from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a very common theme in Gettysburg dedication speeches. Lincoln is cited hundreds of times. George Washington is cited hundreds of times. There are these consistent themes. Truesdale continued. "And yet, after all, how much more and better have our dead comrades done for themselves than we could possibly do for them? We erect and dedicate these monuments to their memory, but they have made for themselves a monument that is more lasting than brass, more enduring than these rock-ribbed hills around us here today. We say they are dead. They are dead, and yet they live. You remember the song we used to sing down in Virginia and make the pine woods ring with the echo of it. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Yes, and this grand army of our soldier dead is alive and is a living force in the world of today. That's an important thing here too to keep in mind, is that these veterans who are speaking by 25, 26 years after the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, they have a lot of power politically, socially. These are the leaders of American society by that point in time. He says they live in the memories and in the hearts of their kindred. They live in the memories and in the hearts of all the loyal people of this land. They live in the influence of their example. They live in the grand results that have come to us as a nation from this war. Are not these things so? Have the father and mother forgotten the boy that went out from their home, never to return? Has the wife forgotten the husband of her youth? Have the children forgotten that their father who died in the war? We remember those sad years when God was purifying this nation in the furnace heat of his judgments. Have the loyal people of this land forgotten their soldiers? He gives them some answers. Let Decoration Day answer, what we would today call Memorial Day. Let the millions our government is paying out in pensions answer. Let the soldiers' homes in these northern states answer. The people of this land will never forget the men who fought their battles and saved the nation's life. They are dead, and yet they live. In the homes and communities from which they went out to die, and in all our land today, they live. And they live too in the grand results of the war. Now he ends by going bigger picture. The nation is saved. The Union is preserved. Not one state gone out, not one star blotted from the old flag. Slavery destroyed. Other nations inspired with a respect for us and a confidence in our future such as they never had before. The liberation and the spirit of progress. The Union not only preserved, but stronger than ever. The nation no longer half slave and half free, but free, truly free and untrammeled to take its place and accomplish its mission among the nations. These are some of the results. In blood and treasure and suffering and tears, we paid a goodly price for these things. But are they not worth the price? This 4 years fratricidal war was a dreadful thing. But now he makes some comparisons, Truesdale does. But for this nation, there was something worse than this war. The dissolution of the Union was worse. Slavery was worse. And so when the gauge of battle was thrown down by those who determined to have a government with slavery for its cornerstone, we said, rather than these things, let us have war, dreadful war, war on 100 battlefields, war by land and by sea. We are sometimes charged with waving the bloody shirt when we talk about the war. Well, of stating the cause of the war, what it meant, what it was fought for, what it has accomplished, if that be waving the bloody shirt, then in the name of all the Union soldiers living and dead, I say let it wave. It's a powerful speech, and that's just a pretty brief part of it. But Truesdale is an example of a veteran who encapsulates so many things. He sees this as his opportunity to explain the war on the place where it probably meant more than just about any other location to the veterans of that unit, and as we can see, to the nation at large. They're speaking to larger audiences. They're speaking to us. Here we have the 107th, the 109th, and the 110th Pennsylvania Infantry. The 111th, the 115th, and the 118th. The 111th is the regiment that I showed you the two little maps where they were discussing where they wanted to put their money. This is the money that eventually came as a result of that. And their speech is interesting in that it talks about Reconstruction, not something that is often talked about in Civil War monument dedication speeches. But Reverend J. Richards Boyle, another example of a pastor giving a speech. He says the results of this war mean the absolute civil equality of all men before the law. Slavery died in the Union trenches. The bondman became at once a freeman, a patriot soldier, and a legal citizen. The United States of America have guaranteed to him freedom, peace, and protection in the exercise of every personal and civil function. And the mandate of this war is that wherever the starry flag floats, he shall enjoy these gifts. This enlargement of human liberty, won by the great contest, is abridged, it is denied wherever the impartial prerogative of every citizen, white and black, north and south, is in any sense restricted or overthrown. He's talking about how by the 1880s, the results of Reconstruction and the results of the war being curved back, and that upsets him, not as just an American, but as an American veteran. The results of this war imply the acceptance, said Reverend Boyle, in good faith, of a new political order by the Southern people. That idea, or I'm sorry, that conflict was decisive. The rebellious armies were conquered. The idea which animated them was exploded. It no longer exists. The whole scheme of the Southern Confederacy has collapsed and perished. There remains not even a lost cause, a phrase that was becoming a very hot button one by that point in time between veterans of both sides. The Union, he said, was literally and unconditionally vindicated, and it therefore has the right to impose terms upon the vanquished. To Boyle, there was a clear victor and a clear loser in the Civil War, and he felt the loser was gaining too much power in the decades after the conflict. 116th Pennsylvania, particularly evocative memorial near Rose Woods. 121st, 139th, and 140th Infantries. 141st, the 143rd, and 145th. Of course, a couple days ago was Flag Day. I think the 143rd is a good example of a color bearer there in the form of Ben Crippen defending the flag, shaking his fist at the Confederates firing in his direction on the first day of battle. Chronologically, there's one missing from here because we'll go to it now, the 142nd. 142nd is one of the more unique monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield. And for good reason. Every Easter, you'll see a lot of pictures on Gettysburg social media pages of people visiting Gettysburg. It looks like an empty cross. Symbolically, it stands in the shadow of the Lutheran seminary. You can see the cupola of the old seminary grove. But the 142nd Pennsylvania monument was not intended to be a cross. Gettysburg compiler on September 10, 1889, the day before this reunion began, talked about this and said that for entirely unique conception, the monument of 142nd Pennsylvania Infantry heads the list. It is a granite representation of a crossroads handboard and will stand on the south side of Springs Road where Reynolds Avenue joins. And in 1888, when this regimental association signed its contract, it described that the sculpture's shape reflected, quote, a granite guidepost with an upright and a crosspiece. Now, basically what that is an example of a 19th century road sign. Crossroads handboard, when you approach a crossroads, like at a town such as Gettysburg, you would have had a post, and then upon there would have been a wooden sign, and it would have directions to whichever town was in each direction. Understandably, though, when we look at that monument today, we think Christ-like sacrifice among soldiers, and that's a way that even veterans of this regiment interpreted it. Horatio Warren, who eventually became the colonel of the regiment, on September 11th, at the dedication of their monument at the Pennsylvania Day reunion. He says that this monument is dedicated to the sacred memory of our brave and faithful associates who did more than we, for as Providence would have it, they gave up their lives that the country might live. He says these men and their leaders determined to give battle and trust to Providence for the consequences. And we see other veterans touching on those same themes. John Miller says, it is fitting we meet on this field where so many comrades have attested their valor and gave their lives as a willing sacrifice to their country and flag. DJ Horner says their blood was shed in a righteous cause. And just as casualties of the Civil War perished, as many veterans said, for the original American sin of slavery, there's this dramatic sentiment that a lot of veterans wrapped up in how they looked at this monument, and that continues even today to visitors. One more here, the 147th, the 148th, and 149th Pennsylvania Infantries. The 149th, interesting example on the right here. Their speaker, Captain J.C. Johnson, said something maybe we could say is controversial. He said that his generation was better than the generation that came before him. He says that essentially the American founders didn't solve all the problems, and we hold that against them. I think today we always have this idea of we look toward progress, we look toward improving what previous generations left unfinished, that incomplete work. This veteran Johnson, he says basically, we were a better generation. He says the generation that freed the slaves is better than the generation that wrought constitutional bonds to enslave the free. 150th, the 153rd, and the 155th. 155th is a good example where they had already erected a monument before Pennsylvania Day, and it would have been just the stone base, the granite base. But when they get more money from the state, they use it to build a statue at the top. And so we see a lot of veterans adding to their monuments, erecting monuments on other locations, perhaps a reserve position that they were in, or an advance marker, anything along those lines. And speaking of lines, a good rule of thumb here for all Gettysburg monuments is they're in a line of battle rule. So when you go to Gettysburg and all the monuments are in relatively orderly fashion, that's not always indicative of where exactly men stepped off, but they follow that line of battle. And that's to clean up the battle lines of Park Roads as time went on. And then we get into the cavalry units that were dedicated there. And we have the 2nd, 4th, and 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry, 17th Cavalry, and the 18th Cavalry. A personal note, my 4th great grandfather, Henry Howard, served in the 18th. Don't know if he was at the reunion. I'd be curious if he was. A couple of artillery units as well. Battery B, 1st Light Artillery. This was Cooper's Battery. Was dedicated. And Battery E, Independent Light Artillery. Knapp's Battery on the right side there. Famous unit at Culpsville. So that'll be all the units that have their monuments dedicated on September 11th, the first day of this Pennsylvania reunion. That's the purpose of it. Soldiers go around, veterans go around with their family members, and they visit those monuments. And there would have been particular times that certain ones were dedicated, and veterans would sometimes go to the other regiments who were in their brigades during the course of the battle. But all day, September 11th, it goes along pretty smooth. That was the plan. Now, September 12th gets a little hairy, and it's hard to read, I'm sure, but on the right side, you can see this is the full itinerary. So up here, September 11th is just dedication to monuments, and all the rest is for September 12th. Not all of this happens, though. So there's supposed to be a ceremony that takes place in the National Cemetery. However, there's a massive storm. It rains. There's supposed to be this parade that starts in town, and it goes out Springs Avenue to the western side to the First Days Field and comes back into town. I believe David Gregg was supposed to have served as the Grand Marshal of the parade. The rain cancels it. None of that happens. So instead, what they have to do is have the ceremony at the Gettysburg skating rink. Now, that building isn't there anymore. It was pretty short-lived, but it was built in 1884 on Middle Street, I believe West Middle Street, the western side of town. And it was built in the midst of the skating craze, which is a pretty short-lived fad, but all around South Central Pennsylvania, the nation at large, I suppose, but Mechanicsburg, York, Lancaster, Gettysburg, they all get these kind of indoor, kind of outdoor skating rinks, basically just large roofs with poles on them. And then it would have been a roller skating rink underneath of it. So the veterans are quick thinking. The organizers of this event determined that they can't do this outside because it's raining, so they do it underneath this canopy of this skating rink. It was threatened to be demolished in 1885 because nobody was using the skating rink itself anymore. So they start using it for events like this. Dan Sickles goes there in 1886 and gives a speech. And he's reportedly in attendance on September 12th to hear the Pennsylvania veterans give theirs as well. There's plans to turn it into a theater. That doesn't happen. So ultimately, it's just this big multi-purpose facility with a makeshift stage. But there are prayers delivered that day. There's the transfer of the monuments to the Commonwealth by J.P.S. Gobin, one of the commissioners we talked about earlier. They're accepted by Governor Beaver. And then there's a poem by Isaac Pennypacker. The last name Pennypacker, probably familiar to many folks. His brother was Samuel Pennypacker, who served in the 26th Emergency Pennsylvania Militia during the Gettysburg Campaign. And he was the eventual governor of Pennsylvania, founded the state police and state museum. There's a synopsis of each day of the battle that is delivered by prominent veterans. July 1st synopsis is by Joseph Rosengarten, who had been a staff officer during the Battle of Gettysburg for John Reynolds of Lancaster fame, killed on the first day of the fight. And then Brevet General Henry Bingham, who was a staff officer to another Pennsylvania general, Winfield Hancock of Norristown. He delivered the speech talking about July 2nd, July 3rd. And now that the monuments have been transferred to the Commonwealth, now they're transferred to the nation at large, effectively. They're going to be transferred to the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. Governor Curtin basically says, these are not just monuments anymore for our Pennsylvania units. They are monuments for Americans at large. And the acceptance for the Battlefield Memorial Association is by none other than Edward McPherson of McPherson Ridge, McPherson Farm fame, former Pennsylvania congressman, ardent abolitionist during the course of the Civil War, clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives during the course of the conflict as well. And he specifically ends this full ceremony with his abolitionist roots. He says that these monuments are dedicated in order to comprehend Gettysburg as a great historic name and as a place in the world. It is necessary to know that the other side, his quotes, fought that human slavery should be the universal dominating interest in the Confederacy. Gettysburg has thenceforth stood and will stand while history endures as a synonym for an indivisible government under the Constitution with freedom and equal rights for all, where it had been struck the first ringing blow for human freedom. Then and therein had Gettysburg its consecration. So the ceremony will end on a very emancipationist view of the war. Gettysburg was the place where emancipation started. Go through some press reactions here briefly as we move toward a conclusion. Gettysburg Dispatch, I think a really interesting cover there. The Little Round Top is transformed, says the headline. Here we can see the fighting on Little Round Top in 1863, and kind of a monument landscape that is left behind by these veterans in 1889. The Pittsburgh Dispatch will say, as many others did as well, it was generally a good couple of days. It was a nice festival, a nice reunion, nice ceremonies. But the rain is the thing that disappoints everyone, obviously. They say the final exercises were greatly marred by the heavy rain. At least 55,000 persons attended the exercises. This is the high end of the spectrum for how many people are estimated to have been there. But that's the Pittsburgh Dispatch's general synopsis of it. In Gettysburg itself, we have the rival papers. Compiler is the more conservative editorial paper. Star and Sentinel, more progressive. Both are on the same page. They stay out of politics when they're covering Pennsylvania Day. The compiler estimated 30,000 people had used 200 vehicles consisting of 1 to 4 horses each. They say the good things that came out of this were the hundreds of eating places and plentiful levels of malt product. They were highly complimentary of Gettysburg as a host and mentioned having 500 extra unclaimed tents. So there must have been some veterans who did not show up. The Star and Sentinel says that the crowd was immense, the dedicatory exercises so numerous, and the weather so horrible that we know not where to begin. A notice of the greatest days Gettysburg has ever had since the contending armies made the field historic. They say that the crowds probably would have been larger if the weather had not been so wretched. Here in York, local papers will respond as well, and their coverage coincides with the dedication of this building, Gladfelter Hall at then Pennsylvania College, now Gettysburg College. York County connection here, named in honor of P.H. Gladfelter, who had given toward the total cost of this building, which was $80,000. Today, it's about a $2.3 million structure. Was paid for in part by P.H. Gladfelter. He gave $17,500, more than $497,000 today. And the architect of that was John Demple, another York connection. The York Dispatch said that Pennsylvania Days was a grand fizzle. Last night, thousands of people left the town, and during the morning, the exodus continued. The Dispatch said the next day that there was disgust at Gettysburg. Rain effectually spoiled the Pennsylvania Day celebration. For a time, it looked as if the clouds would disappear, but the belief was delusive. The York Gazette mentions the 12th Regiment Pennsylvania National Guard was in attendance, active National Guard members who had lost all their equipment in the recent Johnstown flood, which would have occurred just a few months earlier in May of 1889. They said things went well enough, but rain in the afternoon caused the veterans to seek the shelter of their tents. And the Gazette also mentions there was poetry read at the dedication of the 116th Pennsylvania monument by Joseph R. Strawbridge, who was of the city of York. And the Gazette also says that the last of the Pennsylvania Day was a great disappointment. The thousands that filled the place were departing as rapidly as trains can carry them. Rapid fire through the last few here. So we mentioned a few veterans who were disappointed. The Knapp's Battery, they said their monument on Culp Hill was in the wrong location. But nobody was probably as upset as the 63rd Pennsylvania, that monument we saw earlier. At the top of it is the 3rd Corps badge. It's red in color. It was supposed to have a statue of Alexander Hays, who was the original commander of the 63rd Pennsylvania. He was a division commander at Gettysburg, dies as a brigade commander at the Battle of the Wilderness. And the 63rd Pennsylvania files an official message afterward. They say, we unanimously disapprove of the present form of our monument, and we refuse to dedicate the monument until our wishes are carried out. We ask that we be permitted to take off the cap and on the main monument place a statue of Alex Hayes. But they're told they can't, because you can't put a monument, put a statue on a monument that looks like a specific person, unless it's a statue of that person. A standalone statue can't be part of a regimental monument. So the 63rd Pennsylvania veterans shoot back and say, what about the 83rd Pennsylvania? They have Strong Vincent on theirs. And they come back, the Battlefield Memorial Association does, and says that's not Strong Vincent. They said that that's just a man who looks like Strong Vincent. So that's how they're able to get away with it. But because the 63rd said they wanted Alex Hayes specifically, they didn't get it. And then they say that bad weather had doubtless some effect in forming some of the opinions expressed on the subject. The monument still stands like that today. Go through this very briefly, and then we'll wrap up with one final message from a couple of the veterans. The negative response to the existence of a Confederate monument. This is worth a talk in and of itself, a timely topic the past few years, of course. 2nd Maryland Infantry dedicates its monument, also known as the 1st Maryland Battalion, on November 19th, 1886. That's a date that rubs Union veterans the wrong way. That's the 23rd anniversary of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a sacred date for these Union veterans. And it sits pretty quietly, with the exception of a couple of protests. There's a newspaper in Vermont that calls for it to be torn down pretty much as soon as it's dedicated. But Pennsylvania Day, now that these 55,000 potentially visitors have come to dedicate Pennsylvania monuments, a common theme becomes, when these Pennsylvania veterans go home, in their press reports, in their conversations with one another, they say, it was great to get together. I'm glad our monuments are there, but what's up with that Confederate monument? And so here you can see a couple of examples of the pronouncements that will come out of this. Veterans call for it to be torn down. On the left-hand side here is a dispatch that is officially filed by Grand Army of the Republic, Post 88 out of Pittsburgh. They demand that it be removed and that no more of its kind be erected. They call on Governor Beaver to stand with them, and he does. He basically says that it should come down. No other Confederate regiments should be able to dedicate monuments. If they're going to be Confederate markers, let them be placed by the War Department, by the Battlefield Memorial Association. Let them be instructive, not dedicated to a Confederate cause. And so this is a long-standing issue that these veterans have, and it gets pretty dicey. And then we have the publication of Pennsylvania Gettysburg, which is the probably most single fundamental thing, other than the monuments, that comes out of this reunion in 1889. 2 volumes are published in 1893. In 1891, Governor Beaver had addressed the state legislature. He says he would like there to be some way to put into print all the words that were spoken at Gettysburg on September 11th and 12th. And that happens in the form of the publication of these 2 books. And copies are going to be distributed throughout the Commonwealth. 19,000 are printed. They'll go to the attorney and auditor generals, the state treasurer, the secretary of internal affairs, several other superintendents throughout the state. All the veterans organizations will get them. The Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, all the GAR posts will get them. School districts get them. There are 1,000 copies that are given to school superintendents throughout the Commonwealth. 5,000 copies are given to sitting senators and their staffs, and 10,000 for sitting legislators in the House of Representatives. They're going to be, as I mentioned, published in 1893. Additional volumes will be published in 1904 with a couple of the equestrian statues in them. And then in 1914, after the events of the 1913 Peace Jubilee, another one is dedicated as well. So what does this all mean, this Pennsylvania Day reunion? A couple of examples of how these soldiers wanted this to be remembered, and this will be my parting message for you all. T.F. McCoy of 107th Pennsylvania. He spoke of feeling a full possession and enjoyment of the patriotic enthusiasm inspired by being upon Pennsylvania soil, the beloved old Keystone state of the great American Union, anxious to unite shoulder to shoulder with her fellow soldiers in driving the invader from her borders. That's one man's thought on what is the meaning of this occasion. Joseph Rosengarten, that old aide to John Reynolds, speaking on behalf of the 121st Pennsylvania. He said, what has been today will no doubt become part of what has been said today will no doubt become part of the splendid record of the Keystone State. For the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has made Gettysburg a Mecca to which pious pilgrims will come for inspiration as long as patriotism continues to beat in the heart of every man who fought for the Union and inspires their children in the future. William Herbert of 139th Pennsylvania said, much as we have cherished our glorious Keystone State and our loyal people, the action which has made this occasion possible has deepened and strengthened the ties of affection. J.C. Truesdale of 105th Pennsylvania, the long excerpt I talked about a while ago. He says, and now veterans, a word in conclusion. He has some lightheartedness to his remarks. A quarter of a century has passed away since the war. Then we were in our prime. Now we are growing old. The hardtack would be harder for us now. That tender, juicy government beef, fattened on pine leaves, wild garlic, and past recollections, would be a little too much for us now. Our eyes need glasses now. You could not go in with a rush and make the speed in a charge you could then, nor could you make as good time getting out of the way if the other fellows were making the charge. Yes, we are growing old. With the youngest of us, light is at its noon. With many of us stand where the shadows are lengthening, some of us are near its sunset. We ought to be sober, earnest, thoughtful men. We have lived in times and amid events that should make us so. It is natural that we should look back and talk about the war and its results, but our faces must be turned not backward but forward. No party, no people can afford to be content with past achievements. Rather, these should serve as an inspiration to greater achievements in the future. I think that's a very important message that he leaves us with there, is we are commemorating monuments, and us today, we are visiting those monuments. We are at an event like this or other roundtables, other discussions, reading books to understand what happened in the past. But we should use all those pieces to prepare for the future. That's what these veterans were doing in dedicating those monuments. They were leaving them for posterity, for us today to understand their story. I think nobody summed it up better. The last message that I will leave you with is Captain Harry Wilson of the 81st Pennsylvania. He said, we are proud and we stand here today in our glorious state of Pennsylvania. What a thrill. Well, behold that monument and rejoice at last, for the old Keystone State speaks today, and her praises are carved in solid granite. You have waited patiently, and you are rewarded at last, and perhaps it is all the better. Thank you, everyone. We'll put up, as we take questions, and contact information for me there, some projects I'm involved in, but I'll be happy to take your questions. Yes.
Great, thank you for an excellent presentation. Well done. I have a series of quick questions. I think I read on the program that the camp intends on East Cemetery Hill.
Yes.
I can only imagine what that was like when the rain occurred.
Certainly, because yeah, for those familiar, there's that, your Stevens Knoll, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, there's that bowl that fills that landscape, which must have been really nice.
It's not a real level area.
Yeah.
And you estimated how many camped? 50,000?
So the number of veterans, I haven't seen a great figure on, but the number of people who are reportedly there, I guess that'll be veterans, family members, press, is upward of 55,000. The lowest number we see at any time is 10,000. The highest is 55,000. So it's quite a big range. Nobody gives us a really good count. I haven't been able to find an exact number that the Commonwealth counted as far as veterans, but hypothetically, there could have been tens of thousands.
And did the roots of the Pennsylvania Memorial start here at all?
Yes, so we'll start to see, once this has now been accomplished, they kind of set their sights more on equestrian statues to Meade, Hancock, Reynolds. I don't know the exact years on each of those. And we start to see at that time this effort more toward, let's build one grand Pennsylvania monument. And an inspiration for that, I believe, is the dedication of the New York Memorial on Cemetery Hill. Thomas Desjardins, and These Honored Dead, he talks about the rivalries between states whenever they want to dedicate monuments. And when New York builds its memorial, as higher than just about any other, Pennsylvania now wants to have that biggest state monument. That'll come about soon after.
And two other quick questions. You mentioned Confederates, and there was not a good feeling for Confederates at this time at all. No Confederates, I assume, showed up for this at all.
None that I've seen. That's a great question. Yeah, I haven't seen any. A good idea of maybe the feeling is that we can look at two instances just very briefly. 1869 had been the first attempt at a blue-gray reunion. And I say attempt because I've only been able to find 3 Confederate veterans who showed up. And then in 1887, I believe, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, is when the Pickett's Division Philadelphia Brigade reunion will be. So that's just 2 years before Pennsylvania Day. And there's some warm feeling there. Veterans of the Philadelphia Brigade pay for and dedicate the monument to Louis Armistead, his mortal wounding mark. So there are certainly pockets of veterans who have at least a conciliatory feeling toward their former foes. I have wondered whether, because of the connection between the Philadelphia Brigade and Pickett's Division, if when each of the regiments of the Philadelphia Brigade are dedicating their monuments to Pennsylvania Day, I have to wonder if any of them invited Confederate veterans to come along. But I haven't seen anything to indicate that they were.
And last question, you mentioned the speaker for the first day on behalf of General Reynolds. Could you repeat that person again?
Sure, Joseph G. Rosengarten. He's one of Reynolds' aides. There are this series of accounts just going back to the battle where you have Rosengarten, Charles Vale, Stephen Weld, William Riddle. All of these aides become pretty famous because they write about Reynolds' death and the meeting place between John Buford and John Reynolds. But Rosengarten is the one who gives the speech.
Sorry, did you mention Sergeant Vale?
Not earlier, but yeah, right. Yeah, now, yeah. So Charles Vale, yeah, probably the most famous among them.
They wrote thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. That's a good question. Yes.
It's interesting to see, even 20 some years after the battle, about how open the area is then as compared to now around this month. Captured by Tipton for
Certainly. Yeah, I think a really good one is go back to it quick here, the 142nd. Really striking, just I think to me, I notice it because it's right where I work at seminary, but you can see, for those who are unfamiliar with where this is, it's along McPherson Ridge. Reynolds' death marker would be right over here, 151st Pennsylvania. And across that field today, in the swale here, which you can kind of see, we're on McPherson Ridge, that's Seminary Ridge, and there's the swale here. This is all filled today with trees and brush that has grown up because it's the low-lying area where it gets wet. And then almost none of these trees are here today. It's one of the rare places where the situation is flipped, where there were trees there then that are not today. So yeah, these monument dedication photos or dedication photos, but soon after, really instructive to give us a sense of how the landscape has changed. And I think unlike a picture taken, let's say, right after the battle by Matthew Brady, where we have to kind of get our bearings sometimes on what particular landmarks are, the fact that these monuments are lasting, and some of them have been moved, but generally speaking, stand exactly where they were dedicated, we can get a really good comparison to the openness of the terrain. Good observation.
When the regiments got the extra money, if they had their monument there already and they got the extra money from the government, did they get the little plaque put on their extra?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. So I can't think of any specific examples of that. Yeah, but if you added to it, especially, it would just go on the original, whatever the original part of the monument was. And then sometimes we'll see, a good example would be the 121st Pennsylvania. I should have included one of their photos because they're really interesting. You can see the crane that just dropped the monument into place. But they have 2 monuments. They're one of the units that held on the McPherson Ridge and fell back to Seminary Ridge and then Cemetery Ridge, and were involved in a relatively light degree in the repulse of Pickett's charge as part of Chaplain Biddle's brigade on the 3rd day. But they initially put their second monument that was paid for by the Commonwealth right next to the first one. So there's a period where if you look at pictures of McPherson Ridge, there are 2 monuments for the exact same regiment standing 3-4 feet away from one another.
same thing with the 91st Pennsylvania with the Roundtable.
Yep.
They just moved their original one behind.
Yep, great example. Yeah, and usually you'll often see, there'll be a disparity in size. Like the 121st, I believe their original monument was relatively small. They basically got what they could afford, and then their larger monument is paid for by the Commonwealth, and so you keep your larger monument at your primary battle line, and then you put your secondary monument, a smaller one, in another location.
Great job, Cody.
Thanks.
It's interesting that with the kind of the emphasis growing among the Union vets towards the Confederates, at the same time, even in New York here, yet John B. Gordon went around with Lost Cause speeches at the Opera House here in New York and across the Northeast. How do you square those two? The growth of the Lost Cause, the acceptance of the rousing acceptance of John B. Gordon when he came down here, at the same time, the tightening against the Confederates among the Union veterans.
Yeah, it is a great question that I don't have a great answer to. And I think that we do see the biggest trend, and maybe the only explanation I could provide is you see the trend that when veterans are among their own comrades, they're saying and feeling, expressing one thing. But if John Gordon or any Confederate veteran would have been present, let's say at a monument dedication, it seems like that the feeling doesn't go away, but the rhetoric changes. And so I think that might be the way that these soldiers kind of dealt with that, is if you're in the presence of a Confederate veteran, they're upset in an internal way, and we could see that play out in their private thoughts and writings and speeches. But when they're together, that rhetoric kind of goes away. And I think that there is also we see a difference starting to divide, where you have veterans saying one thing, the men who actually experienced the war fighting for the Union saying and feeling one thing, but the population at large is going much more into that reconciliationist direction, maybe buying even more, even in northern states, like here, buying into that lost cause mentality. And I think that probably helps explain why it takes hold so much in the national public at large. I would say that a great bigger picture couple of studies, I'm sure many of you have read one, Race and Reunion by David Blight, takes on that thesis of the nation at large has this very reconciliationist view in the 50 years after the conflict. But I would say, if you've read that book, go read, if you haven't yet, Keith Harris's Across the Bloody Chasm. He kind of takes the same question from a different perspective and says, yes, but when veterans were by themselves, when people were speaking amongst their own comrades, amongst people from their own town, there's still a lot of animus there. It's just that when you get the American public together as a whole, the healing process inspires that idea of buying into the other side, if you will. And in that case, that lost cause mentality. Any questions from online? No? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I don't really have any more specific recommended readings for you other than the Pennsylvania Gettysburg. You can find used copies on Amazon. They're reprinted, but you can find that for free online as well. If you go to Google Books or Internet Archive, just search Pennsylvania Gettysburg. There's 3 different editions. 1893 would have been the first ones published. If anybody wants to see as well, I have printed out some of the clippings from the York Dispatch and York Gazette, more in depth of their coverage. All those up here. Thanks a lot.